So, the wrap-up for Immanuel Kant. Looking at theology and metaphysics, Kant disagrees with Hume's view. Hume said, perhaps sarcastically, that if you take a book and you look at it and it's on metaphysics and or theology, it should be consigned to the flames. Probably really not advocating book burning, but making kind of a sarcastic point. Kant's view, though, is not to burn such books. Kant claims that metaphysics is a transcendental illusion, but we find metaphysics irresistible. Why? Well, we are confronted by, to quote Kant, translated to English of course, by questions which, as prescribed by the very nature of reason itself, it is not able to ignore, but which, as transcending all its powers, it is also not able to answer. So the obvious question would be is, how can we talk about these things? Why should we talk about these things? Well, Kant does make room for legitimate use of these ideas of self, cosmos, and God. So one way to sort of argue for them is to argue based on usefulness, kind of a pragmatic argument, that these ideas are useful for regulating thought, that they provide us with a meaningful frame of reference. And so, even though we cannot, according to Kant, have knowledge of self, cosmos, or God, it's useful to act as if we do. Now, of course, this could be disputed. There are arguments about, should you believe things based on the usefulness, and this gets into what's called the ethics of epistemology, looked at by such folks as William James, the famous American pragmatist, and our good dead friend Blaise Pascal, arguing about God. And so essentially Kant is advancing a useful argument, useful for regulating thought, as opposed to just being practically, profitable. But there's still the question arises, does usefulness provide reason for accepting something? Now he also has the argument that these things are the goals of reason. For example, psychology does act as if there is a self. And all we know of the world, according to Kant, are the finite objects of experience. So it is useful to regard the world as if it were made up of the totality of beings, including those we have not experienced. So what would this idea of the world as a totality, the cosmos, what would it be good for? Well, a case could be made that the cosmos would stand for what we would know if science could answer all questions. That is to say, we had a complete and perhaps perfect, or as perfect as could be, science. So why is this useful? Well, as Kant saw it, it can drive scientists to ask questions, so they might move closer to this impossible goal. So kind of the idea would be that, yes, we can never achieve this goal, it's an impossible goal, but it's useful because it motivates people to ask these questions to advance science. It's kind of like the saying, reach for the stars. You may miss, but at least you'll, I guess, reach pretty high. Anyways, that's not very motivational. So the idea is to sort of set like an impossible goal and, head towards it. Now, of course, someone could counter by saying that if you know the goal is impossible, then it would be, foolish to do it, and it could be demotivational. For example, imagine you're like a coach for cross country or track, and you give people, reasonable goals they could achieve. That could motivate them. If you, show up and say you're going to run a, 3-second mile, people initially will think like you're joking and laugh. But then if you seem serious about it, they'll see that as kind of, obviously crazy. So kind of a problem with that. So what about God? Well, the idea of God, according to Kant, permits us to think of the world as if it possessed a unity with one intelligent cause. Thus, according to him, it motivates us to create a coherent worldview. And so these ideas are useful for motivating us, for regulating thought. And again, these arguments we countered in terms of, well, does the motivational power of these things, even if we accept that it has motivational power, does that justify accepting these things? And that becomes a debate about, again, the ethics of epistemology. So what does this all mean? So how should we interpret what Kant says? Well, some interpret Kant as holding that the self, world, and God do really exist beyond reason because they're necessary for thought. The argument essentially being that, if they did not exist, we wouldn't be able to think, but we can think, they're a necessary condition, so if we can think, then these things must exist. Other people interpret it, of course, differently. So a lot of dispute over what Kant actually meant. And so that wraps it up for our good dead friend, Immanuel